Hey guys, this is Unit 2 Notes number 3, Solving Rational Equations Part 3. So you guys are still doing the same thing, however it does get a little bit more detailed, not necessarily difficult, but if you've been following my steps from Parts 1 and 2, this one shouldn't be that far off, okay? So the same FLT here, I'll give you a second to write it down, press play whenever you're ready, okay? So given a rational equation, you're going to be able to solve it with consideration of its domain. So just a reminder that rational is just a fancy word for fractions, okay? So we're still getting a lot of equations with fractions in them. So knowing that, there's going to be variables all over the place, okay? So I'll show you some of the different variations of what they can expose to you. But here we go. Here's example 1. Write it down and then press play when you're ready. Okay, so nothing has changed here. It might look a little bit different. You might notice that there's one denominator here. That one denominator is just x. Usually it's like a x plus 5 or x minus 2. But nevertheless, it's still just as easy. Okay, so first step, here we go. We find the domain. Okay, since we have fractions, things can go wrong. We have to make sure that all of our denominators, in this case it's just x, we want to make sure that that does not come out to 0. So our denominator, we got to make sure it doesn't come out to 0. And conveniently, there's no need to solve it because x is already solved here. So we have to make sure that our answer does not come out to 0. Okay? X does not come out to 0. So now we get to the solving. All right, so here we go. I'll just box this to the side here. Okay, so if we don't like fractions, we get rid of it. So if there's an x in the denominator here, we want to multiply by an x in the numerator there. But if we multiply it there, we're going to have to multiply it everywhere else. So including that -4 and including that -5x, okay? Now, when you have a factor at the top and at the bottom, it could actually reduce out. So notice how I got rid of all of my denominators here, even though there's only just one. So I'll highlight it to show you what's left. And if it helps you, go ahead and do the same thing, okay? So we have a -4 times x minus a 1 equals a -5x times x. Everything else was canceled out, okay? So I'm going to write that out so that it's a little bit more straightforward. We have -4 times x minus 1 equals -5x times x, okay? Now, I'm just writing this step out so you guys can see it. Eventually, you guys are going to be able to cut your corners here, okay? If I clean this up, I should get -4x minus 1 equals. Now, x times x, when you're multiplying it by itself, it becomes a square. So that's -5x squared. Okay? So this goes back to our previous lessons. When you have a quadratic, meaning a degree of 2, we want to be able to use the zero product property. So the first step is we have to get a 0 on one side. So the easiest thing to do here is to move this over here, rather than taking these two and moving it over here. We're always trying to look for the most efficient move, okay? So here we go. In order to move a -5x squared, we do the opposite operation, which is add 5x squared. Now I'm going to go ahead and add 5x squared over here because there's no other common terms that can go with it. I wouldn't add it to the -4x because the 4x doesn't have a square on it. And -1 is just a constant, okay? Okay, so here we go. My right side is now 0 because I'm setting it up for the zero product property, okay? So here I have 5x squared, positive, minus the 4x, minus the 1. Okay, so now I have a quadratic that's equal to 0. If I want to use the zero product property, I have to make this look like a product. Okay, so here's another refresher in case you didn't get it before. You think about the factors of 5x squared. That's just 5x times 1x. Okay, or in this case, you could just put x. But if 1x is better for you, go ahead and do that, okay? Then you look at the factors of 1. Okay, what two numbers multiply to 1 is just 1 times 1 there. It's not much of a variation. So knowing that there are not a lot of combinations here, it'll make it a little bit easier. So here we go. So we always put in our first factors there. And since it's 1 and 1, that makes our job a little bit easier. But if you guys notice, I'm going to highlight it here. When your constant is negative, the only way to multiply to get a negative is if you have different signs. So your job here is, do I have a plus and then a minus, or do I have a minus and then a plus, right? So here's what you guys do. If you're unsure, you give it a guess. So let's say we put plus and then minus, right? Your goal is to get a negative 4x. So here we go. We check our outer. 5x times a positive 1 is a positive 5x. Negative 1 times x is a negative 1x. That gives me positive 5 minus 1. Different signs we subtract. We keep the sign of the larger number. Does that match up with what we have here? Almost, except that the signs are off, right? So what that tells you here is that maybe we should switch our signs so that it's plus and then minus. You guys keep guessing and checking until it works, okay? So just to show you, 5x times negative 1 is negative 5x. Positive 1 times x is positive 1x. Different signs we subtract, and then we keep the sign of the larger number, which is exactly what we want right there. Okay? That's probably the biggest hurdle that you guys have to go through. So take your time. Okay, there's no rush here. Now that we have a product, something multiplied, that's equal to 0, we can use the zero product property, which allows us to split or set each factor equal to 0. And I'm going to write it out here because it's not so obvious as to what the 0 is going to be. So here it's very obvious, because all you would have to do is think of the opposite. But here's the reason why it works. We add 1 to both sides, so x comes out to a positive 1. But notice how it's a little bit more detailed on the left side here. We have to actually do 2 steps. We have to subtract 1. We get 5x equals a negative 1. And then we actually have to divide by 5. So x comes out to negative 1/5. If you guys do this enough, you'll be able to see what the 0 comes out to just by patterns, okay? But until then, show your work until you see a pattern, okay? So we have 2 answers here, but before I box it, I want to make sure that it doesn't conflict with my restriction. Over here it says x can't be 0. My 2 answers are not 0 at all, so I'm going to box this. I have 2 perfectly good answers, so I have 2 solutions, okay? So the way you guys would write it in your Delta Math is you would just write, so here it would say x equals, you could just write negative 1/5, comma, 1. And that should work, okay? So there you have it. Okay, it's the same steps, but now you're running into multiple solutions. So remember the last few lessons, you only had 1 answer, if anything. Sometimes you had no answer. In this case, we had 2 answers here that worked, all right? But don't forget, your very first step, always check your domain. Okay, so let's practice. Here we go. Here's part B. Feel free to pause and try this on your own. And then press play whenever you're done or if you get stuck. Okay, very first step domain. Do not get to the solving until you check domain first, okay? It will save you a lot of headaches later, all right? So here, since we have fractions, we want to make sure that our denominators, so our denominators are x minus 1, and it's also x minus 1 over here, so it repeats, but I don't need to write it out twice. X minus 1, we got to make sure that that doesn't come out to 0. Okay, so here x is not really solved yet, so I have to make sure that I add 1 to both sides here to solve for x. So here x cannot be positive 1. Okay, that's going to be in the back of our mind. We got to make sure that our answers do not come out to positive 1. All right, okay, here we go. Let's get to the solving now that we have domain out of the way. So first step, if we don't like fractions, we get rid of it. So we're going to multiply by an x minus 1 factor. But if I do it there, I'm going to have to do it here and here, pretty much everywhere, right? And if you have a factor in the numerator and the denominator, at the top and the bottom, you could actually reduce those out or cancel, if you'd like to say cancel. Okay, but notice how it doesn't cancel out here because there's no x minus 1 at the bottom. All right, so let me highlight it if it helps. You should do it too. I have an x left plus a 5x times a x minus 1 equals a 1. Everything else is crossed out. So let me write that out for you guys. So we have x plus 5x times the quantity x minus 1 equals 1. Okay, so here I have parentheses, so right away I might want to distribute this 5x here, okay? So here 5x times x will give me 5x squared, and 5x times negative 1 is just negative 5x. Everything else I can bring down. Okay. Here I noticed that I can actually combine like terms because they're on the same side here. 1x minus a 5x, different signs will subtract. So 1 minus 5, that'll be 4x, but we keep the sign of the larger number, okay? Now here, we'll just bring down the 5x squared, and we'll bring down the equals 1. Okay, still not that different from what we did before, all right? So since we have a quadratic because of the square, we want to use the zero product property. So the zero product property, first we need a 0. So the easiest thing to move is this 1 right here. By doing the opposite, I can move it to the other side. Now 1 doesn't go with either x squared or x, so I'll just squeeze it right here. Okay, so now what we have is a right side of 0. We have 5x squared minus the 4x, and then the minus the 1. Okay, so now I have the 0. Good. Now I need a product. And the only way to get a product is if I factor. Is this the same one as the last one? Oh, how convenient. So we ended up with the same quadratic trinomial here. So that'll make things a little bit easier here. So then you would just factor. That was just a pure coincidence, you guys, okay? So that's just 5x times 1x. So I'll put that here. And that's just 1 times 1. Okay, and I think we did minus and then plus there, okay? So now that we have a product that's equal to 0, we can use the zero product property, which tells us that we could set each factor equal to 0. But I'm not going to write out the steps again. We know that x comes out to negative 1/5 and x equals positive 1. Now, before I box my answers, are there any conflicts to my restriction? So I go back to my restriction here. At the beginning, I said that x cannot be positive 1. So if you guys take a look, oh no, there is a conflict here. So what does that mean? So we won't be boxing x equals positive 1. Now, you would call this, just for the sake of understanding, if you have an answer that does not work, this is an extraneous solution because it's an extra answer that does not work. Okay? So here, I only have one good solution that works. All right? So I only box one of them. So let's say on delta math, you would just write x equals negative 1/5. And then you would submit. You wouldn't write x equals positive 1 because it's just an extraneous solution. Because if you guys think about it, if you were to plug 1 back into your original problem, there would be an issue right there. Because 1 minus 1 will give you 0. And if you divide by 0, the whole equation blows up, right? It's undefined. So you would call it an extraneous solution. Now, you wouldn't say no solution because there is actually a solution that works, okay? So just keep that in mind. Okay, here's example 2. I call it example 2 because it's slightly different, but it's the same idea, okay? So here we go. Press play whenever you're ready. Okay? The first step never changes. We find the domain. Okay? So here's the thing. We have 3 denominators. We have an x plus 2, we have an x squared plus 2x, and we have an x plus 2 again. Now, if it repeats itself, we really don't need it, right? So I'm going to get rid of it. We have to make sure, now let me write it side to side here, that x plus 2 does not come out to 0, and x squared plus 2x does not come out to 0. Okay? Now, here, we have to solve a little bit. We have to subtract 2 here. X cannot be negative 2. All right? Here is what's a little bit different. Okay? In your restrictions, in your domain, you have a quadratic. So here, you would actually have to solve by factoring. Okay? Kind of like the zero product property. But instead, since there's only 2 terms here, you want to shoot for the GCF, okay? So the GCF is pretty much what they have in common. Notice how the first term has x squared and the second term has 2x. They both have at least one x in common. So we could take out an x, okay? X times what gives me x squared? I'll say that again, okay? And I want you to think about it before you hear me say the answer, okay? We know that there's an x in common, but if you take out an x, what's left, right? X times what will give me x squared? That'll be x times x, okay? Now, x times what will give me positive 2x? That'll be x plus 2 because x times positive 2 is a positive 2x, okay? Now, back in Unit 1, what I had you guys do was, I'll do this on the side real quick. What you guys did was you listed out the factors. This is x times x. And this right here was 2 times x. And then you circled what you had in common, you take it out, and then whatever is not circled stays on the inside. If you're more comfortable with that, go ahead and do that, okay? But if you could just try to think about it mentally, if you were to distribute, would you get the same answer? You could do that too, okay? So I'm going to leave that up to you guys on where you are, all right? But here we go. So we factored it. Remember that this cannot come out to 0. We do have a product because it's x times something else. So we could use the zero product property here. We can set each factor not equal to 0. So this is what's slightly different. So pay attention to this part, okay? So here, x is already solved for. Here, x is not. So I'm going to go ahead and solve it here quickly. So x cannot be -2, and x cannot be 0. But notice how these two are the same, right? So there's really no need to write it out twice. So all in all, we have to make sure that x is not 0 or -2. Okay? So let me go ahead and okay, here we go. So now to the actual solving. Okay, so remember what you want to do before you get rid of your fractions. Remember that x squared plus 2x was really x times x plus 2. Okay, so this right here, I'm actually going to replace it into its factored form. So I'm going to erase it here, and I'm going to put x times x plus 2 here, because that'll make things a lot easier in the next step. So take a look. I'll do things in yellow so you guys can see it. If you look at this fraction here on the right, to get rid of the denominator, you would have to multiply by x plus 2. But that means you would have to multiply by x plus 2 here, and that you would have to multiply by x plus 2 here. Okay? And if you have the same factor at the top and the bottom, you could actually cancel it out, right? X plus 2, whoops. X plus 2, x plus 2. X plus 2, x plus 2, x plus 2, x plus 2. But here's an issue. Did we get rid of all of our denominators? Okay. Now, this is where you want to be a little bit organized, okay, and neat with your penmanship. But notice there's still an x left at the bottom. So how do we get rid of that? We have to multiply by an x there. But if I multiply it there, I'm going to have to multiply it here. And I'm going to have to multiply it here. If you have an x at the top and the bottom, you could cancel those out. So now I got rid of all of my denominators. Okay? It looks different, but we'll practice a lot, okay? Here we go. I'm going to highlight what's left so that we are not lost. We have a 5x times the x minus a 2 equals a -9 times the x. Everything else was crossed out, okay? So I'm going to write this out here. Here we go. 5x times the x minus 2 equals -9 times x. Okay? That's probably the most challenging step because you have to be super organized, okay? But after this, everything else is not that bad. By that I mean you see the same things over and over, okay? Okay, here we go. 5x times x is 5x squared minus the 2. And -9 times x is just -9x. We have a quadratic here because of the square. So with a quadratic, you want to try to use the zero product property. And in order to use the zero product property, we need a 0. So the easiest way to get a 0 is if we move this -9x here to the other side. And by doing that, we do the opposite operation. Plus 9x can only add with actually nothing over here. So I'm going to stick it right in the middle because it can't combine with a 5x squared and it can't combine with the -2 because they're not the same terms. Okay, so now look, right side is 0. Great, we have 5x squared. We have a positive 9x and we have a -2. Okay, hopefully you guys are seeing the pattern here. We have our 0. Now we need a product. And in order to get a product, we have to go ahead and factor this. So here we go. What times what gives you 5x squared? That's just 5x times 1x. What times what gives you 2? That's just 1 times 2. All right, so here we go. So first step is you want to throw in your first factors. Now, we have to know where to put the 1 and the 2 in order to get a positive 9x, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just guess. I'll put 1 and then 2. Notice how right here our constant is negative, so your signs have to be different. So I am going to put plus here and minus here. And you know, you might not guess it on the first try, and that's okay, but keep guessing until you get it. And then eventually you guys are going to learn strategies, okay? So let me double check to make sure that it's right. 5x times 2 is positive 10x. Negative 1 times x is negative 1x. Different signs we subtract. We keep the sign of the larger number. And is that what we want? Absolutely, okay? Okay, so now that we have a product that's equal to 0, we could use the zero product property, which allows us to set each factor equal to 0. Okay, go ahead and solve for these two here, and then press play whenever you're ready or if you get stuck. Okay, so here you would subtract 2. X would equal negative 2. Here you would have to add 1 first. 5x would equal positive 1, and then you would divide 5, so x would equal 1/5. Now before I box my two answers, I have to make sure, does it conflict with what I had at the beginning? So let's go back. X cannot be 0 or negative 2. Negative 2. I ran into a conflict here, so we cannot use that answer. So what do we call it? Look back if you need to. This will be your extraneous solution because it's an extra answer that does not work. So really, we only have one good answer, 1/5. So on Delta Math, you would just type x equals 1/5. And that's it. Okay, so let's practice, right? So it's beneficial to factor things out. I think the most important step right here, you guys, is, I'll circle it, is rewriting it so that it's factored first, okay? And I'll show you that here. Let me erase this so that we have space. Okay, here's part B. Go ahead and write it down. Feel free to try it out and then press play. And if you happen to get stuck, you could always press play as well, okay? Okay, first step. Check our domain. Okay, I have an x, I have an x plus 7, and I have an x squared plus 7x, right? I keep writing it vertically. I don't know why. X plus 7, and an x squared plus 7x. Okay, we have to make sure that these do not come out to 0. Okay, here's my recommendation, you guys. Start with the most complicated one, okay? And I'll show you why. So here, notice how you could factor. You could actually take out an x. If you take out an x, what's left is going to be an x plus 7 because x times x will give you x squared, and x times positive 7 will give you positive 7x, okay? Okay, we have to make sure that that doesn't come out to 0. Notice how we can set each factor equal to 0 now, or not equal to 0 in this case. Okay, and notice how we happen to get identical situations. Almost always when you factor, you will get common factors that you can play with, okay? So what this says is that x can't be 0 and that x cannot be negative 7. So all in all, x cannot be 0 or negative 7. We're going to keep that in the back of our minds before we conclude, okay? Okay, so we have our equation. Here we go. So remember to rewrite this into the factored form. So I'm going to erase that and change that to x times x plus 7 because that'll make the next step a lot easier, okay? Okay, first step, get rid of all your fractions, right? So if I want to get rid of this x, I have to multiply by x everywhere. So here we go. But if I want to get rid of this x plus 7, I'm going to have to multiply by x plus 7 as well. So sometimes in other notes, they'll refer it to as the least common multiple, but you don't need to know that. So remember, you can only cross things out if you have it in the numerator and the denominator. So cross it out carefully. Over here, all I can cross out is just the x, not the x plus 7. Over here, I can only cross out the x plus 7. And over here, I can actually cross out the x and the x plus 7. But now I want to double check, did I get rid of all of my denominators? And yes, I did, right? I'll highlight it if it helps. You guys should too. I have a 1 times the x plus 7 plus a 2x times x equals 8. So let me write that out for you guys. That's 1 times x plus 7 plus 2x times x equals 8. All right. So if I clean this up here, I'll get 1x plus 7 plus 2x squared equals 8. Okay? So notice how I have a quadratic here. So I want to use the zero product property. And the first step is to get my 0. So the easiest thing to do is to move the 8 so I can get a 0. And we do that by doing the opposite. Now 8 can only combine with the 7 here because they're both constants. Okay? So now the right side comes out to 0. All right? Now I'm going to write this a little bit strange. Plus 7 minus 8 are different signs, so we subtract, and we should get 1. I'm going to write it over here. But we keep the sign of the larger number, so I'm going to put minus. The square term usually goes in the front, so I'm going to put a 2x squared here. And the linear term usually goes in the middle. That's a positive 1x. I want to write it like that so that it helps me out later when I factor, okay? So here we go. We have a quadratic equal to 0. So we want to use a zero product property. So we have to factor this. And if you want to pause now and do it, you could go ahead and factor, okay? Practice as much as you need to. This is 2x times x. And this right here is 1 times 1. Not a lot of combinations, so it makes it a little bit easier. So we put in our first factors. And since it's 1 and 1, there's really no thinking about that. But I did notice that since the constant is negative, you're going to have different signs. It'll be beneficial if I put the plus here and the minus here, okay? Again, if you're not sure, guess it and then check it. So outer is positive 2x. Inner is negative 1x. That gives me a positive 1x, which is exactly what I want, okay? Okay, so I have a product that's equal to 0, so I will use the zero product property. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0, and then I will solve, okay? So here I can subtract 1. That'll be x equals negative 1. Here I would have to do a couple of steps. I would have to add 1 first. We always do the opposite. And then I would divide by 2, so x becomes 1/2. And before I box these, I want to make sure that there are no conflicts. So let me go back up and check my restriction here. At the beginning, I said x can't be 0 or negative 7. Do I have 0 or negative 7? I don't. So there are no extraneous solutions here. So I actually have two perfectly good solutions. Okay? So on delta math, you would write x equals 1/2, comma, negative 1. And then that's it. So sometimes it conflicts and sometimes it doesn't. But the thing is, if you don't check your domain first, you might not be able to find your extraneous solutions. So always check domain first before you do any of the solving, okay? Let's do one more. Okay? I'll skip part C. Let's do this one. Okay? Try this out all on your own. Go as far as you can. If you happen to get stuck, just press play. If you're done, press play. Okay, so here we go. Domain. Okay. X minus 1 can't be 0, but also x squared minus x cannot be 0. This can be factored as x times x minus 1, and I could always double check by distributing. That's just x squared minus 1x, which is what I had. Okay, good. So we know that can't be 0. So we could use the zero product property. X can't be 0, and x minus 1 can't be 0. Here, x cannot be positive 1 or 0. So I'm going to write that down. Okay, so on to the solving. Here we go. First step, make sure that you rewrite x squared minus x into its factored form. That's going to be x times x minus 1. That'll make everything else a little bit easier, okay? All right, here we go. To get rid of x minus 1 here, I'm going to have to multiply by x minus 1, and I'll have to do that everywhere. And if I have an x minus 1 in the top and the bottom, I can cancel it out. So for instance, I can reduce it here, and I can reduce it here. But notice, I did not get rid of this last denominator right there. So I'm going to have to go ahead and multiply by another x here, here, and here. And we can only cancel it out if you have one at the top and the bottom. So here I have a x at the top, x at the bottom. Here I can't cancel anything out. And here I can't cancel these two out because they're both at the top, okay? So be mindful of that. Okay, so let's highlight what we have left. We have x times x plus minus 1 times x equals a 1. I'll write that out for you. And again, you got to be super organized in this one here, okay? So it's x times x plus 1 times x minus 1 times x equals 1. Okay, so here, x times x is just x squared, okay? Now, here, 1 times x and 1 times 1 doesn't change anything. When you multiply something by 1, it doesn't change anything, right? So, here I have x minus 1 times x. You're going to have to distribute one more time here. So x times x is x squared, and x times negative 1 is negative 1x equals 1. Okay? So I noticed that I can actually combine like terms here. X squared plus x squared, it's kind of like saying $1 plus $1 is $2. So x squared plus x squared is 2x squares. Okay? Minus the 1x equals the 1. Okay, now that I have a quadratic because of that square, I want to try to use the zero product property. First step is getting my 0. And the easiest thing to move to get a 0 is this 1 right here. And to move that, I'm going to subtract 1. But there are no constants on the left side, so I'm just going to squeeze it right there, minus 1. Okay, so now my right side is 0. And I have 2x squared minus 1x minus the 1. If you guys notice, although the problems have different values, the steps are really similar, okay? All right, so now that I have a 0, I need a product, so I need to factor this. That's 2x times x, and this one is 1 times 1. Again, not a lot of combinations, so that makes our factoring a lot easier. Put in your first factors. Since it's 1 times 1, it really doesn't matter where you put it. Now, that is a negative, so that means your signs have to be different. Now, if your constant comes out positive, okay, your signs have to be the same. So either plus plus or minus minus. But since our constant is negative, you're going to have one of each here. So I'm going to go ahead and put minus and plus. And again, if you're not sure, you just guess and then you check. 2x times negative 1 is negative 2x. Positive 1 times x is positive 1x. That gives me negative 1x. And is that what I want? Absolutely. Okay. So that allows us to use the zero product property, which tells us to set each factor equal to 0. Okay. And once you solve, x equals positive 1. Here you got to do a little bit of work. X comes out to negative 1/2. Now, before I box these, I have to make sure that they're good answers. Let's go back to the domain. At the beginning, we said that x cannot be 0 or 1. Do we have 0 or 1 here? We do. It's right here, right? So we call that our extraneous solution because it's an extra answer that does not work. So we have one good solution. So on delta math, you would just write x equals negative 1/2. Okay, and that's it. All right. It takes a lot of practice, you guys. Notice how you have to be pretty organized. So if color coding helps, go ahead and do so. But don't be afraid to ask questions, okay? Because we're going to take it one extra level in the next lesson. So you want to practice as you go, all right? Please do text me if you guys have questions, all right?